I remember sharing the story, I think, with the community at some point, but it came back with full force this week for me. I was 24 years old, about a year and a half, almost 2 years out of my ultra-Orthodox phase of my life. I'd been living in Chaim, Berlin, in Brooklyn, in the yeshiva there, and I'd made my way to New York and left the Orthodox world, and I found myself working at a startup restaurant on the Upper West Side of Manhattan called Garlic Bob's. It's part of a broader network of restaurants in the EJ's Luncheonette and others. They had a slew of restaurants, and I was working there, and I hate to be public about this, but I guess it's also a part of my story. It was a Friday night, I remember, and we had just opened up, and we were kind of a gourmet pizzeria, and there was obviously a very big pizza oven, and one of the workers, my coworker, young man named Ed Rodriguez, was working right next to me, and all of a sudden, Ed collapsed on the ground. And we tried to resuscitate him, and the emergency corps came and took him away, and he didn't make it. He passed away that night. He had a massive heart attack. We didn't know at the time what it was, but he had a pacemaker, and he was only 23 years old, and we didn't know. And I remember wandering the streets of the Upper West Side with the chef, Babs. We were walking around and trying to make sense of it. It was just so shocking. I didn't sleep that night, and so I remember this feeling of restlessness, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the morning, this feeling of complete depletion and despair and a sense of confusion, and also a desire to break loose of something. I wasn't sure what it was, but I felt as though my life, at that moment, I wanted to reconsider everything, and I wanted to just let everything go and leave. And so I remember getting into a car and driving for a long time. I quit my job and from the road, and felt as if I wanted to and needed to break out of somewhere. This story came back in full force when I was meditating with my children this week, as they asked me about a movie that they kept seeing in the queue in Netflix. And it was a movie that I had watched repeatedly, and then I wound up giving a very important sermon in my own personal ministry. It's a very important sermon for me when I talked about taking one step many, many years ago, about a Frenchman named Philippe Petit. And the movie that my kids kept looking at was the movie Man on Wire, the documentary, of course, about this remarkable moment, a moment that I've been obsessed with and have watched this movie repeatedly, including The Walk, which was the feature film about it. And there's one particular moment in the film that I didn't explore in my earlier sermon that very much reminded me of Ed Rodriguez. It was a moment after Philippe Petit had come down off the wire, and he had said in the movie that when he stepped out onto the wire, for those who don't know Philippe Petit is, maybe I should say, he was the Frenchman that walked between the two towers, the Twin Towers, the first and only person ever to do that, and it's a story of that remarkable, mind-blowing feat. And there's a moment where he steps out onto the wire, of course, after one foot is on the wire, and then he lifts the second one off of the building and steps out fully onto the wire, where he says that death was so close. Death was so close, he said. He then, of course, spent almost 40 minutes on the wire, went back and forth 8 times, had the cops of New York wondering who this marvel was. He held himself on the wire on his back, looking up to the sky. It's a remarkable feat. But what then happens when he comes back down after he's taken into custody by the New York City Police Department, and he's booked, and the charge is man on wire. They had nothing else to say, man on wire. He then comes back from this experience, and he has a night. He meets somebody who had watched this. He meets a woman, and they have a night together. And he describes this sensation of having been so close to death that he then felt like he was just going to break out. This night together, of course, is the tragic casualty, as it were, of this remarkable feat, because he breaks the bonds of connection with the woman essentially that had been with him until that moment, his girlfriend, and they never repair. I've thought about that moment of having such a close proximity to death, and then in its aftermath, the inability to hold, to contain, the need for life, as it were, to burst free of any and all boundaries and any and all rules or regulations, the sense of this overflowing upsurging of vitality, of life, charging through the body. There is, of course, a school in psychology called terror management, whose theory is that all of human existence, all of our lives, is some way framed by a terror of our own mortality, of knowing that truth. And that almost everything we do, every stratagem that we have, everything that we construct, whether it's our own egos, our own cultures, our social systems, are all of them in some way, shape, or form a shield, a veil before that truth. As if knowing it would somehow bring everything apart, it would rip it all. In that school of thought, mortality salience, which I've also spoken about in the shul, mortality salience is the capacity that each of us has to be in close proximity to death without the need to employ maladaptive stratagems to gain distance and a lessening of the effect of death on our lives. The more adapted we are, the stronger our self-esteem is, the stronger our sense of self is, the more likely it is that we'll be able to withstand exposure to death to some extent and come out of it with something, or with a response, a reaction that might be more constructive than just letting it all go, without having to just have a night out or a year out or a decade out on the town. Mortality salience is our capacity, right, to have that exposure. We feel this every year as the rush of spring, right? What is spring if not the great expression of nature's relief after having lived through the frozen death of winter? We feel its vitality and its aliveness. They return. There's an emergence. There's an excitement. There's a hope. There's an anticipation. There's sometimes a muted and contained joy that has been making its way within us. It peeks out every now and then. But certainly now we can feel the spring coming against the winter of this last year's pandemic, can't we? And we feel it and we hear it, and we hear people saying things like it'll be a roaring 20s again. That the mortality salience of our culture and our society is so limited that in the wake of a year of pandemic, a year of disruption, a year of proximity to death in so many people's lives, in everywhere we look, that the only response that we can imagine is one where historically we experience mortality and then we just go and have a party. The Torah this week, in what's usually a double portion, the two that usually come together, these two portions, in both name and substance, are an antidote to that mortality salience or lack thereof. Acharei Mot Kedoshim, the two portions that are tomorrow after the death, Kedoshim, holiness. The first parsha, Acharei Mot, deals with the aftermath of a cataclysmic, chaotic trauma, the death of Nadav and Avihu, the two sons of Aaron. In the aftermath of that brush with death, the Torah has a prescription. In the aftermath of a close brush with mortality, one's own or another's, or in exposure to it, there's a desperate need for healing, for a process of deep and thorough reflection and return. Leaders, or in this case, in tomorrow morning's reading, the high priest, must thoroughly and completely cleanse the centers of power, as well as invite individuals to do the same wherever they might be. Death and crisis, or more broadly, simply the human condition, requires that we acknowledge and honestly take steps to live within the reality that has been so obviously thrust into our awareness. We can't deny it. Acharei Mot puts death in the center of tomorrow morning's reading and says there is something called after death, and it's called healing. It's called what happens when we acknowledge that we have been exposed to trauma, to disruption, to dislocation, to pain. We come into the sacred center, we cleanse it, we look inwardly, and we acknowledge that we are frail, that we are fragile, that we are contingent, that we are creaturely. All of death is supposed to remind us of that we're limited. We have limited bodies, we have limited hearts and minds. Those are the prerequisites for accomplishing the overarching goal of building what is the very next piece in the agenda. It is Kedoshim, to build a holy world, but first we begin with our limitations. We begin with Acharei Mot. It's true, we were exposed. We saw it, we felt it. It changed us. It reminded us we're scared. We need holding. We need healing. Our sacred wisdom then sees a lesson in the very next moment. It says, Acharei Mot. It's true that the response to death must also be to pause, to reflect, to ask the right questions, and also to wait for the right answers. But in the aftermath of that, it's not all that is required. We must also then, in the midst of the healing, we must turn our sights on Kedoshim, on making a holy world. After the PSD and after the shock and the jolt of mortality, our responsibility, our obligation is to move from that awareness of life's fragility to the requirement to make life holy, to bring mortality salience into a morality sanctity. From mortality salience to morality sanctity. From an awareness of life's fragility and its contingency to our exposure to Kedoshim, to you. The Torah says you, together, not one individual, but together as a collective, must dedicate yourselves towards making life kadosh, making life holy. And it doesn't happen by itself. The Torah says, after exposure to death, after being on the wire, you might, like Philippi, say, phew, I was close. The Torah says, it's always close. So let's build a world where the time we have is dedicated to making this place more loving, more equitable, more just, more caring, more full of life and the holy. This is the charge of Kedoshim. And at the center of Kedoshim, to you, together, collectively, not one necessarily, but together, collectively, we must dedicate ourselves to the holy. The Torah will then tell us about justice and courts of justice and what it means to live in a just world. It will tell us to not subvert justice. It will tell us that whether poor or whether rich, justice is at the centerpiece of building the world that we want to see. And as it says that, it also says, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. Even as the Torah tells us that there are big systems that must be reformed. Even as the Torah tells us that justice is not about one person, but about all of us together. Even as the Torah tells us about the world it wants to see, it doesn't leave us in only the collective, but puts the responsibility on each and every one of us in the singular as well. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. Mortality salience. A desire to leave, a desire to run away, and then morality sanctity. Build a world of justice. Build it outwardly, build it communally, and don't forget, individually, you can love your neighbor as you love yourself. I think for all of us, this past week, in the aftermath of justice that was done in Minneapolis, the justice that we saw in the trial of Derek Chauvin, the justice for George Floyd and for his family, the justice that represented for so many of us a muted victory, a celebration of what should already be obvious and given, but isn't, was an expression of the turning of mortality salience into morality sanctity. From a conception of closest to death that might lead us into some crazy revelry, to an awareness that death can be a goad to the good. That in some way, shape, or form, what happened this week in the microcosm is the call to all of us and to this country and to the world in the wake of a year of Acharei Mot, of a proximity to death and to liminality and to exposure to pain and frailty and contingency. What we saw in the micro movement this week, small but important bending, as some have said, of the arc towards justice, is an invitation to think more broadly of what Acharei Mot Kedoshim might look like in the coming months and years. What will this year of intense reflection on our limitations, of intense reflections on where we fall short, where we have been, as it were, brought into such closeness to what we can and can't do. How will that change us as we come closer to a emergence? You know, this past Sunday we spoke to about 60 people who were involved in the first ever foundations course in Romamu. 60 some odd people came together to study beginnings, right, of what is Hasidus and what does this community stand for. And we began with sacred person. We began with the notion that loving your neighbor as you love yourself is because that which in you is holy in them too. V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, at the heart of Kedoshim, is what should move each and every one of us to see injustice towards one as injustice towards all. And so we were exploring the nature of this image of the divine that was the question, the prompt for all of you. Who was it that reminded you of the sacred divine? And in that conversation, we talked about Abraham Joshua Heschel's famous question. As recorded by his students, Abraham Joshua Heschel, the great theologian, once asked, why does the Torah forbid graven images? Why the obsession in the Torah, Heschel asked, with idolatry? And Heschel said that you might think it's because God has no image, he said. And any image of God is therefore a distortion. One isn't allowed to make an image of God because it would be a distortion of the imageless God. And Heschel said, no. Let me tell you, I read it differently. It's precisely because God has an image that idols are forbidden. You, Heschel said, are the image of God. But the only way you can shape that image is by using the medium of your entire life. To take anything less than a full, living, breathing human being and try to create God's image out of it, that diminishes the divine and is considered idolatry. And on that, the great Rabbi Arthur Green writes, you can't ever make God's image. You can only be God's image. You can't ever make God's image. You can only be God's image. And you and I and all of us, we can honor that which is already inherent in the other. We can honor that which is already inherent in us. Acharei Mot, we come into contact with life. Life can be catastrophic. Life, as it is, there's no way to hide our mortality. But what we can do is use that as a goad to the good, to turn mortality salience into morality sanctity, to build the world, not to release. I know that had I known more about this at the age of 24, I might have had a different response to what happened. I know that this is not an easy charge. I don't fault us for wanting a roaring 20s. I don't fault any of us. I just feel really, really called on a week like this week to remind myself and you and all of us that we have so much work to do, and we have the power to turn ourselves towards building that world together. and bless you and all of us, that as the spring, as it were, begins to emerge, that we take a couple of breaths and pause, allow healing and reality to set in, and then turn our attention with deep commitment towards building a world of justice, love, and equality.